Okay, everybody, we're going to begin the second session for this afternoon, talking about legacies of Soviet period. Let me just make the obvious argument that much of what I think Hillel and Critique argued about the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union existed is absolutely a precondition, seems to me, for understanding what Russia is like today. However, whatever people call the transition, a much overused word, I think, the nature of what is become Russia today under Putin and even before that, it seems to me it only makes sense in terms of understanding what came before, both in terms of the way the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, how Putin then interpreted that collapse, uses that narrative from the collapse in order to legitimize his own policies today. But many of the structures, if not the CPSU, still remain in place, including, most importantly, the security services. The huge changes, of course, are those which have occurred in the economy and the creation of what you might call a new bourgeoisie. But nonetheless, it seems to me as much of what Putin is derived from what the Soviet Union was. The very fact that he was an operative inside the KGB itself, that he was actually in East Germany when the East German state collapsed. He was there. He wasn't terribly important, but he drew certain consequential lessons from that. He then built up his own base in what was Leningrad, became St. Petersburg, with the group around him. He was then brought into power in 1999-2000 by the Yeltsin family in order to protect Yeltsin from prosecution. And at first, of course, Putin did have an orientation, remember that, back towards the West. Somebody said to me he even attended a state dinner with the Queen in 2003 and went to talk to the City of London, and where they greeted him with great open arms, believing he was the future. But things have, of course, have changed, and no doubt there's an ongoing debate to be had, and is still being had, as quote unquote, who lost Russia, why did Russia go the way it did? But I still would make the more structural argument, an historical one, that much of what we understand Russia to be today has interesting relationship with what existed in the past. Actually, the most interesting relationship between now and then, of course, is the degree of nostalgia. Hillel and I were discussing this. The degree of nostalgia that exists within Russia today about the old Soviet Union. Indeed, making people today, I think, less critical of the Soviet Union than they were when the Soviet Union actually existed, because things have become so tough, and particularly in the 1990s, there was a period, of course, of 10 years, 12 years, when living standards went up, largely because oil prices went up considerably. From $12 to $145, you know, so that really did the Russian economy a lot of good. But there's still now an enormous amount of nostalgia about the past. And by the way, that's a nostalgia on which Putin himself plays, particularly on World War II, on Stalin, a nostalgia even for Imperial Russia. When Sergei Lavrov, his most cynical foreign minister, was asked the question, who advises Putin? He said, Catherine the Great, Peter the Great, and Alexander the Third, all imperial, a lot of Chinese students, obviously. All right, okay. Shall I keep going? Yeah. Okay. What shall I repeat then?
No, it's that you were in China. I've got it into.
Oh, okay, fine.
Because it was getting.
All right, so like you know, I derive quite a lot of experience, at least going around China, being in China, talking to people in China. I don't speak Mandarin or Cantonese, but I've been going there so many times and meeting so many from China does give you insights. You're prepared to listen and prepared to talk and be open and think about what's going on. Now, of course, most of the Chinese you're going to meet in the West are kind of, you know, those who've done well. There's no question. You know, you think of the number of Chinese students, mainland Chinese students come to the LSE, it's about 1,000 out of about 10% of our students. There's about 40,000 mainland Chinese students studying Britain generally. There's over 350,000 in the United States, mainland. So you can learn a lot just talking to a lot of these students, who some of them are very open. and some are not. I mean, and of course they know that increasingly under Xi Jinping, the controls over them have increased dramatically, frankly. They have increased dramatically. If I was to make one general observation, when I first went to China in 2005, it wasn't quote unquote a liberal democracy, but it was relatively open for discussion and debate. And there were a lot of groups on Peking University who were prepared to openly discuss various things about the system. I attended a conference on Xinjiang and the treatment of Uyghurs, being possible to do so now. This was also before Hong Kong and the crackdown in Hong Kong, the national security law. So you could talk about Hong Kong. You could even talk quite openly about the West and what the West was wrong about and right about. Much of that, and I talked to a lot of my Chinese students today, or much of that has gone under Xi Jinping and increasingly become far more controlled, far more repressive. There's no doubt that Xi has turned China not in a different direction, but shifted it, reoriented it in a certain direction. And I get all this from all those who I first met many, many years ago, over a long period of time, with whom I still try to keep contact, but with whom it is increasingly difficult to maintain contact and have open discussions, because they themselves are much more wary of what is happening. They never knew, they always knew the secret police never went away, but it wasn't so over the controls. You now have 16 forms of what is defined as national security in China. And that basically includes nearly any form of information. No, it's not just secrets, it's any form of information has almost become securitized. So you can imagine this had a very dampening effect on debate within China and indeed between what's going on inside China and outside. Anyway, those are kind of some general observations, and all I want to say is I'm not going to put forward a political economy of China, but I'm going to try and say something which, for me at least, makes more sense than much of the literature I read. The literature on China, of course, which there's a vast amount, is dominated, I'm simplifying, but it's dominated by what I would call two narratives. One is what I would call the admirers, or what I think Paul Fleurs would have called the fellow travelers. Now, the fellow traveling about China comes in all shapes and sizes. Business people are very, very pro-China generally, for the obvious reason that China has been a very important source of profit. It's the biggest, one of the biggest markets in the world, massive Western American EU investment there, all the rest, on and on and on it goes. China trades with 122 countries. It's the largest trading partner of about 100 of those countries. You know, China is a market, you know, worth getting into, and it's not surprising, therefore, the business class generally tend to be much more open about China, much keener on China than anybody else. And you can see that as the debates unfold both in Europe and in the United States, where it is the business class, whether it's Volkswagen's in Germany or Apple or anybody else who's very keen on China. You'll see the guy just took over Twitter not long ago, has been in China recently making the case for China and Xi Jinping. So the business class tends to be in the admiring camp. There are others who are in the admiring camp, including, it has to be said, and Hillel hinted at this, some sections of the old left who kind of have a view about China which is pretty pro. One of my former friends from the old International Marxist Group days now writes all the time about China and how wonderful it is. And he knows who I mean. I think most people in the room know who I mean. But, you know, he's become very, very pro-China. So, no, somebody else. So, but sections of the old left, if you like, or new left, however you want to characterize them, tend to look on China very, very positively because they believe it is not a, you know, it's not a classical market economy. It uses the state, and I'll talk more about this later on, as a regulator of the economy. And moreover, the left, I think, you know, has a view about China which is, in a sense, positive because China stands up to the United States. And given that a large part of the left, in a sense, is defined by anti-Americanism as much as by anything else, it always has been, it still is, then the very fact that, you know, China is now becoming pretty overtly anti-American at the political and ideological level, you know, makes the left therefore sympathetic because they're standing up to their hegemon. And some sections of that left also, we'll talk about this later on, exist in the global south, who take a very positive, or at least a more positive view about China, not just because of its economic role. And also, you know, I can't say anything about what goes on in the economics department of the LSE, but I know a lot of economists, ordinary liberal economists, to be pro-China on the grounds that China has grown. China's been an economic success story. How do we get out of the 2008 economic crisis? Because of China, the engine of the world economy when the US and EU were faltering. You'll find quite a lot of people in development economics as well who would be pro-China, on reasonable grounds, by the way, that China has developed pretty rapidly since the reforms of 1978, and especially over the last 10, 15 years. And if you look at amounts of poverty reduction on a global basis, the 6-7 billion people in the world today, the argument is that half of that poverty reduction has been because of China. And moreover, if you're kind of say living in sub-Saharan Africa or Africa generally, Latin America, when you look at the world, who's helping them, who doesn't impose structural reforms on them, who doesn't demand questions about human rights, then China doesn't demand questions about human rights. And there's been a huge, huge development assistance programs, which they've developed over the last 20 years. So it's not surprising that elites in the global South, have a very pretty favorable view of China. So on all those grounds, there's what I would call a coalition of the admirers who kind of view China, in a pretty positive way, with the usual qualifications, however. But nonetheless, there is therefore a fairly, in the same way, and I think Paul in his own work on this, Paul Fleurs here, there was a major constituency for a fellow traveling in the Soviet Union. There were reasons for that, maybe different kinds of reasons today, Paul, but those reasons are there today. And it does impact and change the way people perceive China and understand it, even if they've never been there or don't read the Mandarin or the Cantonese. One book actually, which had a big influence, not on me, but did have a big influence on the debate, was actually written by a former member of the British Communist Party, Martin Jakes. Martin Jakes wrote a book back in 2008, if you remember it. I think this was the publisher's title. He said it wasn't his when he told me, but anyway, it's called China Rules the World. When China Rules the World. Now, again, that got translated to Chinese into several different languages, had a big influence, and kind of expressed the sense that China is the future and the West is the past, and there's that kind of the arc of history is moving in its direction. The other kind of literature is that which you really find on the strategic community, in some of the IR community, and no doubt war planners and many other people, largely but not only, to be found in the United States, although it's also influenced the debates in European Union, and certainly is now influencing the debates in the UK. That is to say that China is rising. It's a challenge to, quote unquote, the Western liberal order, that it has no approach to human rights, which is definably, quote unquote, Western. And therefore, because China is simply rising like a kind of classical Thucydidean situation, Athens and Sparta, the United States and China, this is going to lead to increasing conflict. The West has to wake up to the fact that it faces a challenge by a state which is economically much more powerful than the Soviet Union ever was, and actually has a story to tell. And that story is increasingly appealing, again, largely, but not only in the global South, where that story is not about, having a revolution, but being transformed and supported by a kind of the Chinese model. And again, you've seen an enormous shift, and I'll talk about this more in what I call the strategic IR community about China. China has risen from being, kind of cuddly panda, although I'm told that pandas are not very cuddly, by the way, but rising from being a cuddly panda to becoming, the single most important challenge to the Western liberal order in the 21st century. And it wasn't just Trump who said this, it's also Biden, although he's being Biden and not being Trump. He did it in a much more intelligent way. But nonetheless, the same underlying strategic assumption is that the great 21st century challenge to the quote unquote liberal order dominated by the United States and the West is going to be China, ain't going to be Russia, and that's the kind of line. So you've got this two kinds of literature about it, and of course, even if they disagree about how they view China, positively or negatively, nonetheless they both agree that China has risen. I mean, if you kind of debate the Soviet Union in the 1980s and 1990s about collapse and decline, disintegration. If you pick up any book written over the last 20 years, it invariably has the word rise in it. the ascent of China, the coming of China. So it's a more positive story, I suppose, from one point of view. But they both agree about the rise. The question is, why has China risen? Use that term. I kind of use the terminology which is in the literature. There's varieties of explanation. I've gone through the literature quite carefully on this as to why has China succeeded in economic terms? I mean, put it rather bluntly, put it rather simply. There's a number of explanations. One is a classical one, which is labor supply. You've simply had a massive labor supply. And now, a good part of that may still live in the countryside, have attachments to agriculture, as Hillel said. But much of that is now working in towns, in factories, and in big cities. Even though they may go back to the countryside and retain relationships with the countryside, and they do, nonetheless, the majority of those are increasingly working in towns and in big cities. But they don't get residents, by the way, full-time residents in those cities, which is a bit like the old Soviet system of propusts. And one argument is that that labour supply is still there in plentiful abundance, and therefore that can continue. It's a bit like the argument that people had about the old Soviet Union. How did the Soviet Union continue to grow for such a very, very long time? Because there was a massive labour supply coming from the countryside to the towns. Second explanation, this is one which clearly didn't apply to the Soviet Union to anything like the same degree, is that what China has done very effectively and very smartly is, of course, borrow from the West. Borrow, beg, or steal. It doesn't really matter which verb you want to use. They borrow very, very heavily from the West. In other words, much of their high technology until now, and that may be changing, has been basically taking up, joint stock companies with Western companies, utilizing the research and R&D that went into Western companies, and basically adapting it and using it. And indeed, many of the things that the Western companies object to sometimes in terms of doing business with China is that a precondition for doing the business in China is you've really got to hand over a good part of your R&D. I.e. all the work that you've done over many years, involving no doubt millions and possibly billions of research, in order that it can be incorporated. And of course, that is also about intellectual property rights. So, borrowing putting it nicely, borrowing very heavily from the West, which is also, of course, a source of dispute with the West today. The third part of the argument, and they're all kind of connected, and I'm just going through the arguments before I get onto my own, which I think will not challenge any of this, but will add something, I hope, to the debate, is basically what China did pretty rapidly after 1978 was simply adopt the market. And I mean, it's a simple story. I mean, it's over simple, and anybody who's been to China knows it's over simple. Until 1978, particularly following the disaster that was the Cultural Revolution, until Mao's death in 76, and then the ascent of Deng Xiaoping in 78, and then the whole going through the various plenums, which declared that Mao was 70% right, but 30% wrong. I don't know which percentage. At one stage, they were talking about Mao being 80% wrong, and then they said, no, that's far too critical of Mao. Someone said, what about having them 50-50? I said, no, you can't have them 50-50. So anyway, oddly enough, they ended up with 70-30, which I think was the same they did for Stalin under Khrushchev, wasn't it? 70% right or 30% right. I can't remember. But anyway, doesn't really matter. But then the market was introduced, first in the countryside. They didn't decollectivize, but they allowed peasants to keep their surplus and sell it bit by bit. You allowed small retail firms to come in. It's been written about in numerous textbooks about the economic reform program. It runs through the 80s, the household reform. Deng Xiaoping actually visited certain countries outside of China. He went to Taiwan, or he didn't go to, but he went to Japan rather. And he thought, well, my goodness, they're doing very well. What are we doing wrong? He went to Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew, said, you're doing really well. What do I need to do to enrich China? And then Deng Xiaoping came out with a series of, well-known Chinese sayings. It doesn't matter what color the cat is, it's black or white. Does it catch mice, and all various other things like that. But in essence, what he was saying, we can use the market. We can use the market. And of course, the argument that most Western liberal economists would therefore say is that the reason that China has risen essentially is adopted Western market norms, Western market forms. The fourth aspect of this briefly is, of course, that in the 1990s, after a fairly extensive debate within the party leadership, under Deng Xiaoping and then under Jiang Zemin and then under Hu Jintao, there was a long debate about how to orient towards the Western economy, And then the argument was we would orient towards the West. In other words, we will buy into globalization as it was then unfolding under Clinton. And the moment of transition of that was joining the World Trade Organization in 2001. Now, under the terms of the WTO, if you read them, which are worth reading, by the way, because most people don't, it says you've got to move to a market economy, and in practice as a market economy, which China has not yet become, by the way. That's another question I'm going to raise. But nonetheless, opening to the WTO gave China what they call most favored nation status, MFN status, which meant basically you could trade without any tariffs going back and forth. And there's no doubt, if you look at the growth figures, the growth of the economy after and this is what Trump jumped in on, of course, against the WTO. He could say, well, look, once we join this trade organization, it hurts America more than it benefited America. And who benefited from it most was, of course, China. So labor supply theory, borrowing from the West, joining the Western economic order, and of course, adopting the market are all the reasons. I want to argue something else is maybe a bit more contentious. I think one of the reasons it succeeded as well, and this is not an argument for it, it's simply, I think, an empirical approach to trying to think about it, is that China has retained very large numbers of Soviet and Stalinist forms. It's the retention of call it Soviet if you want. Western rights call it Leninist. I prefer to call it Stalinist. I don't mind what you say. It doesn't matter what term you use, although it does a bit. I mean, but I think it's also the retention of forms which it had absorbed from the Soviet Union, which has given it, therefore, abilities to control and maintain control, and indeed to facilitate growth. So that's why I think Hillel hinted at, and this is pretty obvious, this is what makes it a hybrid system. You know, it isn't one, from a simple point of view, the Soviet Union was one system, if you like. I mean, I know that's overly simple because the private sector did begin to come in. You know, so we've got a kind of a spectrum from pure market to full-scale planning. Well, if the Soviet Union was, let's call it full-scale planning, even though it wasn't proper planning, I know that, and you want to go right over to the other end of the spectrum, you know, full-scale market, then where therefore within this was China fit? And the argument is it doesn't fit on either end of the two spectrums. And in a way, some would even say, now, for many Western economists, this is a contradiction. And in the end, China will have to go to a full-scale market. And they can't therefore live this hybrid system, which is both state and market. This is, however, is not where China's going, and that's the important thing. It has not moved in the direction that Western liberal economists want it to move. In fact, if anything, under Xi Jinping, it's gone the opposite direction. I just recently wrote, it was more a think piece than anything, you know, of any great merit intellectually. I just finished writing a little piece somebody published somewhere. I called it How Soviet is China? Because when you go through much of the economic literature, there's hardly any mention of the Soviet structures, or what I call the communist structures, the Stalinist structures. Many Chinese intellectuals you talk to think of China as a unique civilization. There's a kind of uniqueness to the civilization, and therefore it is in itself its own reference point. There's quite a strong tendency on that you find amongst many, for understandable reasons, given 5,000 years of what China regards itself as being a civilization. But I wrote in this piece, whatever the differences are between the Soviet Union and China, and they are real. I'm not disputing the differences. There's no doubt about the differences. You know, the 2,000 billionaires that exist in China never existed in the Soviet Union. Money is money. It is real money. And by the way, people do work. and, you know, so the differences are pretty obvious to anybody. And instead of beginning the process of decline, which the Soviet Union finally did in the 80s and then collapsed in the 90s, you know, a lot of people say it's going in the opposite direction, although we can open up a debate about where China is actually going. But what I simply try to do in that piece, and it just grew on me as I kind of started writing it. So, and it's very unfinished, and it's maybe not terribly original either, but I wrote it anyway. I was kind of interested to explore this problem about how Soviet is China. And I kind of did it in 5 ways. One is that if you simply look at the state party structure, start with that, it actually is very derivative of the old Soviet system. I mean, it really is. I mean, you know, what Mao borrowed from Stalin, and he borrowed heavily from Stalin, by the way. He borrowed very heavily from Stalin. Indeed, as you know, one of the great reasons that Mao broke with Khrushchev was Khrushchev's critique of Stalin. That was one of the reasons he broke. It wasn't the only reason, but one of the reasons he broke ideologically with Khrushchev was a revisionist who abandoned Lenin and abandoned Stalin. And so it's not surprising, therefore, the structures of the party, which have been given effectively transposed quite literally in the 50s into China from the Soviet Union very, very heavily. That those structures and the state and party structures have persisted. There was a cultural revolution, as an undoubtedly, which turned China against the Soviet Union, and of course, in the end, led to a short-scale war. But it was a highly militarized relationship, which continued until the 1980s, and now it's gone in a very different direction now. But nonetheless, the original state party structure persisted in really quite fundamental ways. You know, the language, the structures, the party cell structure, the hierarchy of it, the notion of a Politburo, a central committee, even the iconography of the Communist Party of China is very much the iconography of the CPSU. Indeed, you will always remember that in Marx's 200th anniversary of his death, 1818 to 2018, you know, who celebrated that more than anybody else was in China. Indeed, they celebrated it so much they got a Chinese sculptor to build a sculpt of Marx in bronze, by the way, paid for it, transported it, and it's now sitting in the middle of the town square in Trier, where Marx was born. And so, you know, I know we can then get into a debate, oh, is this really Marxism? What does it mean really? Does it really mean Marxism then? They're not really Marxists, are they? But nonetheless, you know, there is that state party structure and all the modalities of discussion within the party, you know, pull upon a whole series of language and forms of language, narratives, which I think are very easily recognizable to anybody used to kind of read stenographic reports of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the 1950s or in the 1960s. And I think that is really quite, but and then add to that, of course, there's censorship, and that censorship has actually got even tougher. And of course, an aspect of the Soviet system was censorship, and extensive controls over the population, which Hillel talked about. In relationship to the Soviet, in relationship to the USSR. If anything, under Xi, those controls have become even greater using technology. AI has really come to the aid of Chinese control by the state party apparatus over individuals and citizens. You know, traveling becomes very difficult because every time you travel, it will go into etc., etc., etc. You know, it's in other words, the development of technology itself and the rapidly change of technology, you know, improvements in technology, which should liberate us, it's actually acted as another form of control. Another aspect of the old Soviet system, and again, I'm only going over stuff you probably already know, but it's important to emphasize how much it goes on within China itself, is simply a control of the narrative about history. It's not, I don't need to quote Orwell or anything like that. You know, he who controls the past controls the future, controls the future, controls the past. The winners always write history. I know that. That's kind of cliche. But it's quite remarkable how Xi Jinping particularly, but not only, but Deng Xiaoping too, they were absolutely certain that you had to control the historical narrative about China's past. You know, there couldn't be debate. There couldn't be a debate. There had to be a single party narrative about it. And I'll come on to Xi on that because this also comes back to how China today views the collapse of the Soviet Union, coming back to the relationship between China and the former Soviet Union. In fact, Xi went through a whole debate about this. And again, all of this is in English, so I'm not pretending I know the Mandarin, but it's all in English, and there's a huge amount of translation work that's being done out there. It's easier now to get the translation stuff as long as you're prepared to dig into the various websites and various other places, which I do most of my life. It's a bit weird way of spending your life, so that's what I do. But Xi was very clear about this. He said, we've got to fight historical nihilism. Nihilism. And what did he mean by it? He said, what we've got to do is three things. One, we have to focus on what is positive about China and its achievements, not what is negative. Therefore, please don't talk about the following. One, the great leap forward between 1958 and 1962, which probably led to the deaths by starvation, if not deliberate, of about 25 to 30 million people because of those policies. You may want to go lower, you may want to go higher, but you're still talking several million Chinese who died really, out as far as I can see, from largely unintended consequences of ridiculous policies pursued by Mao in the countryside. You won't find any discussion of that going on at any level, maybe at the very highest level of the party ideology of people in Beijing or Zhongnanhai. Come to the Cultural Revolution, not mentioned, not discussed. It's really not. When I was there, whenever I mentioned it, a silence fell over the room. Normally, I tried very hard. Let's talk about the Cultural Revolution. There wasn't very much a demand for that. I mean, people wanted to talk about it. The students really did want to talk about it. I know that. But nonetheless, and many of them have been affected by it, by the way. Many of them have been affected. Their parents had themselves been purged or they've been sent out to the countryside. I met one of my best friends in Peking University had spent 10 years as a cowboy. Why did he spend 10 years as a cowboy? Because he had to get out of Beijing. So it was too dangerous to be in Beijing. So he went off to become a cowboy, I think in Mongolia somewhere. Absolutely true story. And so many got, sent out to the countryside. Millions got sent out. Even Xi Jinping's father was expelled from the cities. You think Deng Xiaoping's son, I think, was thrown out of a window. We don't know how many people died in the Cultural Revolution, but its impact both on society and culture and not just on intellectuals, but certainly on intellectual life, business life, economic life, was an utter disaster. You can't talk about that. It's one of the black spots of Chinese history. And the other thing you can't talk about, of course, was another aspect which is talked about a lot in the West, was the Tiananmen Square. And what happened in April and May in 1989, as the Soviet Union was withdrawing from Eastern Central Europe and finally from East Germany, the Chinese Communist Party was re-exerting control and power through the PLO. And we're learning a lot more about that. Now, there's a lot of memoir literature and all of those coming from Chinese citizens who live abroad largely. Some Western scholars managed to get into the archives in China quickly enough in order to dig up some of the material on the Great Leap Forward and on the Cultural Revolution. There's a huge literature on the Cultural Revolution written by people living out, Chinese citizens who were there, their parents got purged and everything. And there's obviously quite a lot of thousands of people left China after Tiananmen Square. So we do know, but this is not discussed within the party and not discussed within the schools. This is just pushed around. And this strikes me, again, it's another form of Stalinism. You read, what did Trotsky once write about the Stalinist rewriting of history, the Stalinist falsification of history? And it seems to me that's precisely what goes on in China, what goes on in China. I think at a certain period in the 1990s and in the early period up until about 2010, it was more open. There was discussion, there was more discussion, but that has all been pushed out completely. The other thing I'll talk about really on the relationship is what happened in 1991 itself in the USSR. Here again, there's a linkage between what we were talking about this morning and China today. Xi Jinping has, and indeed all Chinese leaders since, because they saw the USSR as part of the larger socialist camp. Whatever they may have thought about the USSR, they still saw the USSR, like Eastern Europe, like East Germany, and like Hungary, like Romania, they saw it as part of the larger socialist camp. They were still comrades in the sense, therefore, by 1987, 1988, they didn't really like Gorbachev. And so suddenly, this disintegration, for all the reasons we can talk about, including the one forwarded by Hillel, this disintegration, and again, I've gone through the discussions in the party, and again, it's in the English, this disintegration was a shock of the first order to the party leadership. A shock of the first order. They couldn't quite believe what's going on. And when they saw what was happening in East Germany, for instance, they were actually advising, so I was told this, they were advising Honecker, be tough. We did it in May in Tiananmen Square. We prevented the counter-revolution happening in China. We sent the tanks in, we did the repression. We restored the socialist order, which needed to be restored against forces of Western liberalism and bourgeoisification. You should do the same in East Germany, because they were not listening to China so much as they're being determined and shaped by what was happening in Moscow, which took a rather different line. And actually, I'm pretty pleased they did. And then when you get to the disintegration of 91 itself, again, when the near coup occurred in the Soviet Union, I've been going through some stuff on this, it's fascinating stuff. The near coup, which occurred when about August of 1991, when Gorbachev was arrested and all the rest of it, and they're outside the White House and Yeltsin standing on the back of a tank and all the rest of it. The Chinese nearly ran in and recognized the new provisional government. They were so keen to make sure that the old order was maintained. In other words, they didn't want to see this thing go under. They didn't want to see either what happened in Eastern Europe happen. They didn't want to see what happened in the USSR happen. And I would argue that they've had to try and deal with this question of disintegration as a central part of what China is today. And I think, again, this kind of feeds into my broader argument about the Sovietization of the debate, because what happened to the Soviet Union is like the major object lesson for the Chinese leadership today. It mustn't happen to us. Now, interestingly, again, and I could go into more detail than you probably require. It's very interesting. During the 1990s, when I first went there, they were having really quite open debates about why did the USSR break up? Why did the USSR disintegrate? And they in very thorough style. And I'm not mocking this, by the way. I thought it's really quite remarkable. They set up a series of different commissions. I think David Shambaugh, who's quite a very good Western sinologist, if that's the right term, David Shambaugh said they set up about a dozen commissions to investigate the causes of the dozen possible explanations as to why it went under. Was it to do with nationalism? Was it to do with not reforming early enough? Why did it go under when it had so many capabilities? You know, I mean, obviously they clearly not read Hillel, but you know, they kind of couldn't believe the quote unquote a socialist superpower with, you know, hundreds of weapons, you know, massive energy resources, and a scientific basis too. You know, it wasn't that Soviet science was all bad, and Soviet mathematicians were pretty damn good, and they could develop certain things, as we were talking about this morning, not as much as I think Paul made out, but yeah, they could do stuff. They could do stuff. So how could this extraordinary superpower under socialism go under? And I think in broad terms, and this is why I'm summarizing it for simplicity's sake, the first argument, broadly speaking, was that the USSR should have reformed earlier. In other words, it should have gone for economic reforms earlier, but not change the political structures. Gorbachev got it the wrong way round. He went for glasnost, perestroika, openness and debate. He opened up a debate for politics and didn't start seriously addressing the question of economic change. And he tried to do both together, which was doubly disastrous because you ended up with economic decline and political collapse. And also he abandoned Marxism, Leninism. That also became part of it as well. So Xi, when he came in, and he'd been very interested in this debate, actually pushed the debate very much towards the other end of the spectrum, saying the problem which led to disintegration wasn't that the USSR reformed too early, wasn't it reformed at all? It shouldn't have done it in the way in which it was finally done. In other words, therefore, Gorbachev becomes the problem. And of course, Yeltsin is even more of a problem because he's the classic capitalist roader. And later on, I was told by people, it's not secondhand gossip, but it was generally remarked that Deng Xiaoping used to sit there apparently smoking his 80 cigarettes a day saying, this guy's an idiot. What the hell is he doing? He's got no idea about what he's up to. He's kind of downplaying the monopoly role of the Communist Party. He's downplaying Marxism, Leninism. He's being too friendly to the West. The West will always take advantage of you because you're a socialist country. They'll undermine you, and that's he's gone that way. And therefore, without going into too much detail, that is the route we must not go down. And I think this is in a sense, therefore, Tiananmen Square and the reimposition of party control and centralization, or not that it ever went away completely, becomes, I think, part of the condition of this. And again, this is quite a controversial argument to put forward, but it means that maintaining stability and order became a reason for economic growth. And indeed, you do hear many Chinese writers saying in the 1990s, If we're going to go for destabilizing market reforms, and they can be destabilizing because people are going to lose their jobs, there's going to be social dislocation, we're going to get rid of safety nets under workers and other people. If we're going to go in that direction, you have to maintain strong controls from the center as a precondition for moving to the market and moving towards globalization. So I'll kind of leave that one argument to you. From the last point I want to make really about how Soviet is China really does do with the economy itself. It's certainly true, and I've visited China on several occasions, and I meet many of the Chinese students here who come from relatively pretty well-off families, without a doubt. Nothing wrong with that, you know, they just work very hard, so they come here, you know. It's certainly true. At one level, it's completely unlike the Soviet Union. You've got a large middle class, they have money. You know, it's got people say it's got the largest middle class in the world. You know, high net worth individuals come out of China in very large numbers. You know, all the high, if you visited Hong Kong or you visited Shanghai or Beijing, all the high net worth end brands are all, whether it's Italian fashion, French wines, or whatever else. There's a very large number of, you know, how do you afford an education at the LSE? I couldn't put any of my kids through an LSE education, too damn expensive, you know. Yeah, well, some of them can. And of course they go to very expensive colleges, not all the expensive colleges in the US. You know, there is a very, very large Chinese middle class that's coming to being. There is a billionaire class. I think I said earlier on, I think it's about 2,000. And so therefore it's easy to think of China having therefore become post-communist, post-socialist, or post-Soviet, really. In a sense, it's become a bourgeois society in all but form. And all you've got left over is this kind of residue from the past, you know, that old stuff left behind, but it doesn't really mean anything. I get a lot of my Chinese students say, oh, that doesn't mean anything. It really doesn't mean anything. But I think it means quite a lot. And Xi Jinping, I think, has made it clear how important it becomes. And you can certainly see this, and again, in terms of the structure of the economy. Now, it is certainly true there is a very large private sector operating in China, there's no question. However, much of this is operating within the framework laid down by the party and the state. And state-owned enterprise, SOEs as they're called in the literature, comprise about real 25 to 30% of the Chinese economy. So it's a large part of the Chinese economy, and even that part of the economy which is quote unquote private still has to operate within a framework laid down by the party and state. A little less so now, but they know there's a point beyond which they can't go. And Jack Ma certainly discovered that very, very quickly. And you know, so even the richest man in China, a bit like Khodorkovsky in Russia, discovered there's a certain point beyond which you can't move. Now, there is clearly, therefore, a very vibrant, if you like, middle-class culture, middle-class consumption levels. You can see this in cars, you can see this in all sorts of ways, travel and all the rest, tourism, participating in almost an Americanized way into the global consumer culture of the world. All that is true. My first feeling when I first went to China is, you know, the admiration for the United States when I first went, it was really very, very high indeed. Less so now, I'm finding, when I talk to people. But that's another question we can discuss. But the SOEs, state-owned enterprises, it is true they, quote unquote, they only comprise about a quarter of the Chinese economy. But to use our old-fashioned term, they control the commanding heights of the Chinese economy, which is very, very important. In other words, they control banking, they control finance, they control the bond market, they control aviation, they control whole areas of the economy which are central to the broader functioning of the economy. So it's not just that they are less than what is the private sector, it is that it's where they are located within the economy, which of course then gives the party control over that part of the economy. Now, and they're getting stronger. They're not getting weaker. Xi Jinping has been very clear about this, that he favors the SOEs more than he does the private sector. Now, which leads me to ask the question and then maybe make a conclusion. Why? Why? And it seems to me that having a state-owned enterprise is a kind of quite Soviet thing. You know? You've got big nationalized industries, huge nationalized industries in banking, agricultural banks, and aviation, various other things. And of course, the military itself and all sorts of other things is under the control of the state. Now, the simple answer often given by some economists is that it gives the Chinese Communist Party control. You know, the easiest way for the Chinese Communist Party to maintain control and leverage is to have a part of the economy which it directly controls. And so you can see, if the Communist Party wants to stay in control, therefore you have a large state-owned enterprise sector. I think there's something in that. I mean, this is why I think Xi, who's very party-nost, makes a great play on state-owned enterprises. But I think there's a larger reason, and I would trace it back to the 2008 Western economic crisis. That what happened, and again, I think this is not often discussed, what happened in 2008, I think had an enormous impact on China. Apart from the fact a lot of people were made unemployed. I mean, over 20 million became unemployed very quickly. But it was the question, how could you get out of the hit that had occurred because of 2008. Now, if you'd done it just using market means, which means basically you don't have any control, you wouldn't have got out of the potential slump that China might have entered into as a result of 2008, which occurred right across large parts of the Eurozone, of course, hit the United States very heavily for at least 2 to 3 years. And I think this may be the key to the role of state-owned enterprises, because it's the quickest and easiest, the most effective way of channeling money into the economy directly through the state, either through local government. And that's why you saw an enormous amount of infrastructure building after 2008. Now, much of that was not driven by market forces or prices or anything else. It was driven by the state itself through the party, pumping billions, trillions of dollars. One of the biggest Keynesian moments in history, I should imagine. The biggest Keynesian moment in history, think about it, after the 2008 crisis. And you couldn't have done that through the market. You could have done that through the principles of, supply and demand. You followed a Hayekian policy, you'd have ended up, with a complete collapse of the world economy, not surprisingly. And I think the Chinese have therefore derived the view that if you simply allow free markets to operate, you're going to end up with much more volatility, far more instability, and less ability to manage and control the economy. In other words, it works. In other words, in a sense, it works. And the kind of standard Western liberal economic argument that it's simply dysfunctional because it's not the market, therefore it's dysfunctional because it's not the market, simply makes absolutely no sense. I see it from the point of view of where China is today. And I think that's going to get stronger over the longer term. Anyway, I'll leave it there with some thoughts. We can talk more about, what's going to be, how is China relating to the global south, which we'll talk about later on. How China relates to Russia, which is an interesting topic about which I'm trying to write a book. Why is the Communist Party of China has ended up allying itself with somebody who admires Kornilov and many other fairly dubious characters in Russian history. That's much part of. And what does this also mean for its relationship with the West? And I think that's what I was going to end on, or maybe begin on, but I'm going to finish on it. It seems to me that part of the explanation for the conflict between China and the United States, which I think is very real. I think it's objective. I don't think it's subjective. It's not psychological. As Hillel said, it's not psychology we need here. We need some objective analysis of structures. And it seems to me that part of the fundamentals of it is that in the end, the Chinese Communist Party still maintains and retains a large degree of control over its own society and over its own economy. It also retains, of course, control over its own currency, which can never become free-floating, by the way. The yuan and renminbi can never become fully free-floating because it would mean opening up the economy, and that's something the Chinese Communist Party is never going to like to do if it want to retain control. In other words, it sees the contradictions of capitalism, analyzes them, and say, well, we've got to resist that in some ways. And in some ways, for the moment, and whether it can last forever, I don't know, but it's something which they believe actually works and works better than what they see happening in the West, particularly after the 2008 crime. But I think it's also a source of conflict with the West, because what the West really wants is an open market economy. I mean, the EU still does not recognize China as a market economy. The United States does not recognize and understand China to be a market economy, by which it means a fully open economy. Now, think about what the implications would be of China becoming a fully open market economy. Well, I would imagine in their view of the world, this means the United States is going to play a very, very bigger role in controlling and managing China internally as well as externally. It also means an erosion of the influence and control of the Communist Party, which, of course, Xi Jinping and the 90 million members of the Communist Party are not about to do. So it also seems to be part of an explanation for why this conflict is going on between and getting worse and getting more intense, and it's likely to become more intense over the next few years. So I'll leave it with you. I wasn't going to talk about China in the first instance, but Hillel kind of opened it up for discussion. I thought, because we talked a lot about the USSR this morning, I think I know a little bit about China, or at least try to learn as much as I can. I thought some reflections might help for opening up a debate. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, everybody. Thanks very much. Yeah. So we can take questions, and I'll try and answer it. Paul.
Yeah.
Paul, yeah, use mine. Yeah, we cracked it. Yeah, LSC technology. Try it. Job there, Paul. It's not working. It's not.
Possibly Ukrainian.
Well, I won't go there.
It's not that Soviets.
Okay. Right. Okay, Paul.
Right. Yeah, a couple of things really, just questions. The securitization and the restrictions. Will this not be a problem in respect of innovation of and just general running of things? Because it stifles initiative amongst things. People won't think outside of the party line. And we saw this within the Soviet Union, that and in the established world, in Nazi Germany, where it leads to dysfunctionality, as no one wants to challenge existing visual lines, and if it involves in science, technology, then social studies and that, it's actually restrictions on it actually damage the ability of a society to sort out solutions to problems.
All right. Can I deal with that one first?
Yeah.
Stay away while I remember the question. If I get two, I forget what the first one was. It's kind of strange. I mean, look, you know, logically and empirically, you would think that if you restrict information, you can't innovate and you can't think critically. You can't have a series of different perspectives coming in and therefore debating one with the other. And you know, there's you know, quite a good literature on that. And if you quite, you know, without getting too Popperian about it, if you don't have an open society with debate and information flows and all the rest of it, and you know, ability to test yourself against other people and be shown up to be wrong, blah blah blah, then that will restrict flows of information and therefore will dampen down technological innovation, because nobody wants to kind of put their head above the parapet. You know, there's something in that. You know, I think there is something in that. I mean, my general view was that when I was in China, I did feel that even when I was there in a more open period, that people were very wary about what they could say and couldn't say. But what is quite interesting here, Paul, is it's, to use the phrase, yet it moves. Yet it moves. In other words, if one kind of looks over the last 10, 15 years, I mean, two or three things have happened. One is they've been able to borrow very heavily from Western technology. You know, so, you know, the Western business community has transferred a lot of technology, as far as I can see, into China. So you don't always have to innovate it yourself, as long as you can get it from somebody else and buy it from somebody else, or borrow, beg, or steal it. And that seems to be what's happened. So, you know, in a way, if you've got a big enough market, and others may have a different view on that, but if you've got a big enough market and a big enough ability to get that technology, you can bring it in, and it would seem, and again, there's a lot of literature on this, and it doesn't always come to the same conclusion, but where China has actually forged ahead, and this is an interesting phenomenon, is in the areas of high technology, that they, in a way, that they have moved up the scale of production. Now, you could see this in all sorts of ways. Look at their 5G, look at Huawei, look at what they've been doing in space, look at, you know, the innovations they've developed in global warming and the sales of, you know, all various other things. You can see it when you're in China. Even when I was in China, last time I was there, 2017, was it? You know, you could still see it in the ways in which, you know, nearly everybody used iPhones as means of communication. You know, so it wasn't anti-tech. No, quite the opposite, almost at the opposite end of the debate. Now, whether that can go on forever, I don't know. But certainly from the United States point of view, and this I think was one of the other transitions in America's reaction to, you know, When China was producing cheap goods for the American consumer and therefore keeping inflation down and maintaining the living standards of basically large sections of the American working class and others, they were very happy, extremely happy, you know, because, you know, goods coming in at 1/10 or 1/5 or whatever, you know, that's great. It's when China's moved into the tech areas that the United States has become more and more concerned. Moreover, and what this comes back to my original argument, much of this is coming out of the state-owned enterprises as well. It's not just coming out of what you might call, quote unquote, the private sector. So yeah, I've got no easy answer to that one, Paul, other than to say that I think the jury's out on that one, but maybe others have another view.
Right, so thanks. So yeah, the other questions are, but the Uyghur question. It seems to be particularly gratuitous. This repression of a nationality in the Western of. It doesn't seem to make any rational sense. Is it because they want to clamp down on a national group which is having problems with respect of the?
Okay, well,
To set the example for the rest of the minorities.
No, not really. No, I don't. Well, I think the Uyghur issue and what happens in Xinjiang is quite unique, actually. Firstly, by the way, it's a very important economic area for China. I mean, cotton and various other things are grown there, you know, so it's very important, apart from being strategically important because it's on the border with several countries. I would say, first and foremost, the reason for, I don't think the crackdown was real, by the way. The crackdown was very real. I mean, okay, there's maybe some exaggeration there, but the crackdown was very real. Question is why? Their argument was largely about security. Their argument was largely about security. There had been, quote unquote, radical jihadists had gone into Afghanistan, radical jihadists had undertaken a series of attacks within China itself, etc., etc., etc. So there was a security issue. You can't brush that under the table. It doesn't justify anything the Chinese state has subsequently done. But they come down with a very heavy, very, very heavy hand indeed. There also could well be, and I mean, again, this is pushing the argument out a bit too much. This is what people said to me. So I'm really reprogramming what some people said to me was, you know, this kind of strong hand Chinese identity, a very strong hand Chinese, and it doesn't mean to say that therefore they're opposed to all the various, there's large numbers of different groups around China. I mean, it's not all Han Chinese, but 90% of the population thereabouts is Han Chinese. And some would even argue that this Han Chinese identity was very powerful in terms of, you know, the relationship with Uyghurs, who are a very different cultural group, you know, speak a different language, practice a different religion. By the way, I'd also say, by the way, if you want to understand what has happened in Uyghur, in Xinjiang, you might want to go back and look what China did in Tibet, or has been doing in Tibet. You know, you kind of go for economic development, your modernization, and you go for very large numbers of Han Chinese to go and live there to kind of reduce the kind of, you know, the Tibetan character of Tibet. So if you like, China has form on this one. The fundamental point of this, and this is the most fundamental point, China is one nation. And, you know, there's going to be no liberalism when it comes to handling nationalities or ethnic questions. You know, this is, I think, deeply inbred within both the political system and the ideological structures of Chinese thinking. So, you know, don't step out of line. You know, you're not going to get a Tony Blair solution of devolution or anything like that in China. You know, it's a centralized state, and that centralized state, you know, has to maintain its authority wherever it is. What is quite extraordinary, and I'll end here, by the way, what is quite extraordinary is how many of the states which define themselves as Islamic have not criticized China. I mean, you know, it's quite remarkable. I mean, you know, the increasingly close relationship, say, between China and Saudi Arabia, China and the Middle East more generally, China and Iran, by the way, too, by the way. The states which are defined as Islamic states, whether you understand that, have been very uncritical of China, have kept very, very quiet. They've just sent a very large delegation to the Xinjiang capital. So, you know, draw your own conclusions, you know.
Yeah. The final question
Oh,
is,
three.
yeah, is that's what I was just saying.
Oh, that's good.
China versus the West.
Yes.
The Cold War, I was thinking, you wrote some very good things on that, about
Nice.
it being a balance,
Yes.
like an arch, which
Yeah.
met at the top, and therefore kept a stability.
Mm.
There was very little in the way of economic links between Soviet Union and West.
Exactly. Of course. Yeah.
If anything, it was more like a third world country,
Mm.
and that sort of thing, sending
Yeah.
produce. China's different in that the economies are, well, how much stuff just around here
Yeah. Yeah.
is made in China.
Sure.
The
My jacket, I think.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I think so.
China's really got into consumer goods, which the Soviet Union never did, even for internal consumption.
The quick answer to this question for me,
Making it whole.
yeah, no.
Making
Look,
it more explosive.
it kind of raises more problematic questions about what the relationship actually is. The truth of the matter is, the Western capitalist world, here the US, here the EU, here Japan, Australia, whatever you want to call it, that which is defined as the West, in broad ideological terms, if not geographical ones, is highly dependent on China. There's no question about it. You can't get away. It's market, many other things. I mean, we might have even had a deeper recession after 2008 if it had not been for the Chinese economy. After the 1998 Asian financial crash, China was very bright, very brilliant, and actually came in to support the Asian, Southeast Asian countries, and actually built up quite a lot of goodwill by not taking advantage of the 1998 financial crash, and built up quite a lot of support in the area because of that. So the level of dependency now on the outside world, economically speaking, not politically, is very, very high, which means, of course, this is what I said earlier on, in the camp of the admirers, not surprisingly, you're going to find the countries or the places which have been, become most dependent economically, or the business classes, are the ones most likely to be, not exactly calling for a new Cold War with China. You can see that in Europe. You can see that in France. When Macron went to China, remember what he did? He said, well, let's not get too het up over Taiwan. Let's make sure we don't just follow the United States along the line they're going along. Oh, and by the way, I've brought along 55 French businessmen to sign up about. And by the way, when Lula went there, apart from signing up to basically the Chinese narrative on Ukraine, we can talk about that if you like. Apart from that, he took 250 Brazilian businessmen, So that tells you, now nobody was going to take 250 businessmen to the Soviet Union and vice versa. So that therefore changes the question of the relationship in deeply significant ways. Now, you can draw from that, Paul, two completely, I think, two entirely different conclusions. One, it therefore means that China's more of a problem, because it's got more leverage over the West, and because it's wealthy and has the capacity to last much longer than the Soviet Union. It has the wealth, it has the material capability to challenge the West, as we're seeing both in Latin America, in the Middle East, and in Africa. And in doing it in an economic way, and therefore it's more secure than a political ideological way that the Soviet Union did. So it makes China more of a threat or more of a danger or a challenge. That's the kind of argument I think you'll find with Biden. The alternative, sorry to be on the one hand, but on the other, it's very English, isn't it? On the other hand, you could take the view that because China is itself dependent on the West and vice versa, therefore there are, to use the terms of Joe Biden, there are guardrails. There's kind of a limit beyond which you don't want to move without precipitating, quote unquote, a world economic crisis, because that's what would happen. There's a person I know who does a lot of work on China, is very conservative, though he knows China really well, he knows Chinese very well. He said there's going to be no big conflict over Taiwan. Why? Because it would lead to a world economic recession, a world economic crisis, from which neither China would benefit, nor would Taiwan benefit, nor would the United States, nor would the hardcore kind of let's go against China kind of lobby, which is now. So I don't know how to pull those two arguments together, but they seem to be opposite sides of the same coin on that one. Yeah, sure. Yeah,
They can't hear it from here. Oh, you've got a microphone.
I'm okay. You need one. I've got one. I'm okay.
Unfortunately, I would draw the opposite conclusion to
Okay.
Ilva's point. That's why we're going to have a world war.
Okay, good.
Because
Jesus.
the United States, the guardrail for the United States is once they can't hold back the technological development of
Okay.
China, they've got everything to lose. It's the end of hegemony.
Okay.
Anyway, just a few comments. I think your introduction was really good, but just a few things.
Okay.
You can't compare China, the transition in China, to Russia, because Russia, the vast majority of society was working class. In China, the minority of society. So therefore, in the Soviet Union, the transition had to be a big bang. They had to concuss workers, get it over and done with in case workers rose up and raised their own independent demand. So you can't compare. And that should always be taken into account. You're right about copying, but actually copying was the less important part.
Okay.
What China did, but they were so successful, is they focused on export industry.
Yeah.
So they accumulated foreign currency. This was centralized in the People's Bank of China, which meant they could buy the most advanced means of production, particularly from Germany, South Korea, Japan.
Yes, sir.
And once they mastered that, that was the bigger
Yeah,
issue. Then now, in terms of size, China's up until 2 years ago was consuming 50% of all the world's raw materials bar oil. That includes chips as well.
Yeah. From Taiwan.
Its the industrial base in terms of volume is 3 times as big as the United States. In terms of manufacturing, it's the equivalent now of France, Germany, Japan, and the United States put together. So we shouldn't just use dollar terms. Your point about cutting down on debate and discussion should always be seen in the context that Xi now sees China in a siege economy. You know, all those US bases surrounding like a necklace. So that's an important point to make. In terms of currency, when China reaches technological equivalence, has its own multinationals, by definition, it has to liberalize its currency, otherwise it will hold back its multinationals.
Exactly.
The dollar is only strong because of United States technology, nothing else. Once the United States loses its technological edge, it loses the dollar. Your point about guardrails again, capitalism's entering in a really profound recession globally. And at the same time, instead of reducing cost price, which is a countervailing factor to the rate of profit, they are increasing cost prices by disruption to the supply chains, which is really, really significant and actually eclipses by a large magnitude the gains coming from deep learning, from neural networks, which some people call artificial intelligence. My final point, I think, is the most important. Because we kind of see China as the strange capitalist economy, we do not use the tools that Marx gave us to analyze the economy, particularly the rate of profit. Now, the Chinese Bureau of National Statistics, you can actually work out what I call the complex rate of return, because they don't distinguish financial assets from fixed assets, on a monthly basis in China. On a monthly basis, and you can work out the rate of turnover on a monthly basis, circulating capital in China. And I can tell you this, the rate of profit peaked in 2011 in China. It is now down by 2/3, 2/3. If you want to understand why the investment wave in China has petered out, investment now in volume terms is barely positive in China, barely positive. In the private sector, it's negative. And the reason for this is the rate of profit. Now, the rate of profit isn't simply something we talk about. The rate of profit is a limiting factor. If you're going to accumulate, you can accumulate on 2 bases, through the expansion in the mass of surplus value, the rate of profit, or through debt. There's no other way to accumulate. So the collapse in the rate of profit in China means that the ability of China to redo a 2009 is gone. It's non-existent. It's non-existent. They are facing the same crisis So Z may talk ideology, but in the end, he's writing the law of value. And the law of value is very unforgiving. The labor, and I'll go back to my earlier point in the concluding sentence, the labor of the individual in China becomes part of the labor of society indirectly. It doesn't matter if they're employed in the private sector or the public sector. It is production for exchange. It only gets realized through exchange. They are suffering the same crises, the same problems, the same limitations as a normal capitalist society. And that in the end will be the undoing of Z. It will be the undoing. And that's why the 2020s is the decade of revolution, counter-revolution. Humanity, it's make or break for humanity this decade.
Well, I won't reply to all those points. Some I agree with, some I disagree with. Doesn't matter. On the last point, though, about, I mean, I don't know if you noticed the front cover of The Economist not very long ago. The front cover said "Peak China." So it made the argument in rather different terms to you. You talked about the law of value, not surprisingly, being The Economist, or exchange value and commodities. But nonetheless, it has arrived, and I think there is, even amongst those who kind of used to celebrate Chinese economic growth, this miracle, you can see a degree of uncertainty now. Now, they normally explain it in terms of the COVID situation coming out of COVID, but that's clearly not enough. That's clearly not enough. They try to also explain it in terms of the crisis of globalization and deglobalization. But again, that seems to be more symptomatic rather than a deeper cause. So I think, whereas we've seen over the last 20 years, kind of almost 30 years, since 78 even, kind of almost China, the word rise may not be used as frequently now. And I think that, for whatever deeper causes, some of which you've identified and others identified by others, I think China is entering into a much more turbulent period. By the way, I'm getting this even on a kind of an everyday basis, talking to friends in China. For instance, levels of unemployment now amongst young people in China is about 20%. And people going into universities are not getting the jobs they want. So if you go to halfway reasonable, there's a lot of halfway reasonable universities in China. Even some of my students just go to Peking University, which is the elite of the elite university, makes Oxford look like a comprehensive, it's so elitist within China. Even they can't get the kind of jobs that they always used to be able to get before. And interestingly, one final point is, many of them, when I first was teaching there, again, I got on very well with them. I was trying to be very open with them about who I was. Many of them said, well, I'm going to go into the private sector. I'm going to become an entrepreneur. I'm going to do this, that, and the other. Very American, if you like. Now, many of them are plumping for trying to get state jobs because it's so much more stable and so much more secure. So it's an interesting kind of phenomenon about the place. Yeah. Thanks. Some great comments. Yeah. Hi.
Yes, I mean, you went for a long list of admirers, right? And people who don't want to be in conflict with China. They are business and they are firms who are dependent and they're intellectuals and whatnot. So you think, well, what's the counter argument to that? And of course, that brings us back to Ukraine, right? Because Ukraine, the NATO war in Ukraine with Russia, and I'm not supporting Russia, I'm just saying the war, that is developing the idea of the just war. And how many people are opposed to that? There are people on the left who are not opposed to that. So the next spot, of course, is China. If you can justify a just war against China, all that admiration could fall away.
Yeah.
Right? So that becomes not an issue we're taking up at the moment. And it may become the most important issue, justifying the just war. Whatever NATO does, right? It's not Vietnam, folks, it's Ukraine. We're justified in defending Ukraine. We're justified in attacking Russia. That could happen with China. So that idea of justifying the just war may become the most important political issue. Right? Yeah. Almost the opposite of Vietnam, or rather a sequel to Vietnam. A more anti-war movement that says we are against justifying Washington seeing the opportunity to hit down on its rival, its main rival in the world. Yeah. So that becomes the main political issue. Okay. Don't justify the just war, not by supporting one side or the other, by questioning the competition between these two big rivals. Okay. Like in the First World War. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Look, we can have a larger debate about what line, how to understand, how to explain the origins of the war in Ukraine. I would have a pretty different view to you, but we don't want to get into that at the moment.
what I'd be more interested in discussing is how China itself is trying to orient towards the situation in Ukraine. I'm trying to write a book about the Russia-China relationship. And in its own way, by the way, it's a very interesting relationship, which, you know, it even goes back to the 1920s. I mean, it goes back to the origins. It goes back to the origins of the Chinese Communist Party in the 20s. It goes back to the 1949 revolution. You can take it through the Cultural Revolutionary period. Then there was a near war between China and Russia. Okay. And then bridges started to get built in the 1980s. It started under Gorbachev and under Deng Xiaoping, and it continued in the 1990s. There was then a treaty in 2001 between Russia and China. And by the way, the first thing they needed to sort out, and I'm not talking about the war, but trying to explain why I think they've become so close to each other and whether this presents real problems for China or not, being attached to Putin, whatever you might say about the war. They then, at that point, made two very important statements. One was about the border between Russia and China. And I lived in Northern Ireland for over 20 years, so I think I know a little bit about borders and the potential for conflict. So getting the border out of the relationship was really important for China and Russia. It's a 4,500 kilometer long border. And stabilizing that was absolutely vital. They spent hours, days, weeks trying to sort the border question out. The second thing that they came to an early conclusion, and this game may fit into your own argument, even if I don't agree with your conclusions. They actually came to the conclusion that a world run by the United States, a unipolar world, is not one they feel comfortable with, because a unipolar world is one where the United States can call all the shots, essentially, in essence. You know, the dominant hegemon will always be able to be in a position to shape everything, whether it's from Kosovo in 1999, the Iraq War, and whatever. So I've been very interested, simply in the first instance, to try and analyze how deep that relationship is and how that relationship has, in a sense, been a 25 to 30-year relationship. So Xi Jinping, in a sense, has tied himself to Putin. There seems to be no doubt about that, which in itself, it may, and indeed has tied himself into, and you and I may not agree on this, so let's be clear about that. But I mean, on the other hand, he's tied himself into what he calls, in a sense, the Russian narrative about the war. The Russian narrative about the war, you know it very well, is that NATO enlargement threatened Russia, that in the 1990s, the West did not do enough to support Russia, should have implemented a Marshall Plan, blah, blah, blah. The United States, in a sense, wanted to see Russia weaken, not strengthen. You know the argument. And that therefore, what's happening, therefore, in this tragic and appalling war, which none of us support, of course, in a sense represents a kind of NATO war, justified in just war terms, not necessarily in the religious terms originally, but nonetheless it's justified. But what has been very interesting is how close Russia and China have remained throughout the conflict. I think it is posing huge problems for China now, support for Putin. Now, I see people as kind of disagreeing. I think it is posing problems. I think it is posing problems for them. You can't deny the problems there. I'm on the side of saying, well, actually, China's stuck with Putin for very good reasons and will continue to stick with Putin. Nonetheless, I think we have seen over the last period of time some worries on the Chinese side about what's actually happening. I mean, it's moving in both directions. You know, they're kind of worried about escalation. They're certainly worried about potential use of nuclear weapons. What's recently happened on the dam would, I think, worry the Chinese quite a lot, because they think that Putin is escalating it, if that is indeed what happened. You know, so well, I'm just telling you what I think is happening. So I generally do take the view that China and Russia are very close on this war. No, not that China didn't want the war. China didn't want the war, but it's stuck with Putin through the war because China has a larger agenda. The larger agenda is to challenge US hegemony. I mean, and if Russia is part and parcel of that agenda to challenge US hegemony and the Western liberal order as it sees it, et cetera, then it will stick with it. Nonetheless, I think it has posed problems for China, which you can't entirely ignore, particularly in terms of its relationship with the EU and the European Union, with which it wants to maintain good relations. And he wants to kind of, in a sense, divide the European Union from the United States. And that becomes more and more difficult the longer this war goes on, because what that war has done is actually bring the EU and the United States much closer together, which was not exactly China's major. And also, by the way, I think they were more or less informed by Putin. We don't know the full story. They were more or less informed by Putin the war would be over in 3 or 4 weeks. In other words, there was massive miscalculation on all sides. Yeah. That's my take on that. Yeah.
Savas online.
Ah, here's Savas. Hello, Savas.
Go ahead. If you unmute yourself, you should be able to speak.
Hello,
Hi, yeah,
Tabas.
go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay,
Sure.
thank you. First, thanks, Mike, for your thought-provoking report on China. There are many issues that I would like to discuss. Unfortunately, we have no time. So I will make it first a comment and then a kind of question. I mean, the comment comes from two warnings by Trotsky. First, not rush to have a finished definition on an unfinished process. The second, it is that we have to look to hybrid social formations without rush to make, to classify them very strictly and very formally.
That's what I was
And
doing.
this is, I think, the case both of Soviet Union, of Russia, post-Soviet Russia, and China, particularly that we discussed now. You mentioned the question of the control by the Communist Party of China on history. There are two issues here. Do you think that in 1949, a revolution was victorious or not? Was just a regime change or a revolution, a social revolution? One. And in my view, yes. And without that, without the unification of the country against the dependency from foreign powers and the colonial control, etc., there will be not the material base both for the zigzags that followed as well as for the opening and the later growth by cannibalizing this conquest of 1949. That's one issue. Then at least my personal experience discussion with the Chinese, it is I did discuss with them on the Cultural Revolution and in other matters. And even there was, as probably you know, it was, quite recently, last year, when I was in Shanghai, a conference on the left opposition in China. And never I had hidden to them that I'm a Trotskyist myself. And I had no problem on that way, of course, in the limits the bureaucratic control always pose in a very clever way sometimes that you can be trapped. So, I mean, it is, there is a lot of questions to see what will happen. In my view, yes, it is true that both in 1997, in the Asia-Pacific crash, as well in 2008, the Beijing cleverly used its policies to secure its own, to defend itself from this impact of the world crisis. But nevertheless, I think particularly the crisis after 2008, its protracted character, its spiraling character, continuous shocks, one different from the other. I think they're behind many of the zigzags of the Communist Party of China policies under Xi Jinping. There have another kind of problems, not the problems that led to this, to the collapse of the Soviet Union because of historical reasons, etc., but they have problems and they try to fight them in a bureaucratic way, of course. And I don't know how we'll move from very soon. Then they have the consciousness that they're interconnected with the world capitalist economy, and vice versa. You know, we know that recently the chief executive of JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon, was in Shanghai, and he spoke and saying that his fear that the US-China tensions will upend the global order, and that will be worse. The worst thing that happened after the Second World War and worse and very different than the previous Cold War. It's not a new Cold War, it's something else which is going on. And you have really to have a clear Marxist understanding of very complex process which in which we are. Finally, the third, you raised the question of the conflict, the competition on hegemony. Okay, even in the official rhetoric, they speak a lot about the decline of US hegemony. And but at the same time, I think they are quite clever to not, and they said even officially, that they don't want to become the new world hegemon. And they speak, the official propaganda is about the multipolarity, etc., etc. But the question is the following. We don't have just a decline of the US hegemony. We have, US was the highest point of historical development of global capitalism. So we have a decline of global capitalism, and some sectors, at least of the elite in Beijing, they understand that. That is more complex than the question of the hegemony of a national power. It is a question, and they know very well the interconnection of the world economy that they cannot ignore. And they have, at least some of them, consciousness that we are in a period of decline without, of course, this was one of, by the way, in my view, of the contributions by Hillel and by the critique, particularly the last years, on to develop a theory of decline in connection with the theory of the transitional epoch. And this is the problem. Nobody, I think, seriously can believe what Arrighi, later Arrighi, had said in his Adam Smith in Beijing, that Beijing will replace Washington. Rather, much more realistic it is, again, when Trotsky said in Europe and America, that Americanism can be replaced only by world socialism. For that, we have to fight by revolutionary means. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Savas. Good to see you. Look, you raised that on your first point about what Trotsky said about hybrid systems, and we shouldn't just use simple categories. In some ways, I think that's where critique began in 1972 and 1973. In other words, you had a series of categories, simple categories, on the Marxist left, and indeed from more orthodox right, as totalitarianism, workers' state capitalism, whatever you would call it. And it struck us then, and it equally strikes me about China, that those kind of categories simply don't work and don't help us take the analysis forward, trying to understand complexity. And in a way, what I was trying to do in my presentation, however incoherently, or maybe less persuasively than I thought, it was simply to point out that, you know, this is a very hybrid system, you know, which has developed 2,000 billionaires, but is still run by a highly orthodox, you know, Communist Party of China, which both celebrates Marx, but also, if you talk to economists in China, celebrates Adam Smith and the Chicago School. You know, many of whom want to go and study in the United States, but go home and then denounce the United States as hegemonic. So it is very hybrid, and it's that hybridity, it's a horrible word, which I think I was simply trying to drive at, you know, to try and understand. How is it you can have what appears at one level, certainly for a lot of liberal economists, in a sense, a successful market economy, which has become, quote unquote, post-communist, as they would call it, nonetheless with the Communist Party, which still has, you know, many of the levers of control over the economy, and with the state-owned enterprise sector, which is still pretty significant in the running of the. So I take your point on the hybridity of the system, and then in a way, you know, and I think that's what Trotsky was trying to get at when he talked about the Soviet Union. Not that I make any comparison between myself and the old man, not at all. On 1949, yeah, no, of course it's a starting point in a world revolutionary sense. No, in a massive sense, I agree with that. I wouldn't dispute that at all. But I think one's got to be careful at the same time not to kind of then, well, turn that into, or at least translate that into, therefore, all sorts of, I don't think you were saying this, but therefore all sorts of necessary positive things followed from that. mean, a number of things followed from it. Mao was a Stalinist. Mao was 100% Stalinist. I mean, well, I don't know if it could be worse than Stalin, but, I mean, he was a Stalinist, and therefore there were Stalinist practices within China. And with huge consequences, as indeed were the consequences from Stalin's policies within China, which we really need to talk about without kind of getting notions of defense of China. Or, I know you weren't quite saying that, but I think I would be a bit. But your last point is one I really want to pick up on about decline, because it's very interesting to see how the argument about decline in general, not just American decline, has entered into the debate, both from the Chinese and also, by the way, from the Russian perspective as well. Now, Mao said this, Mao said it, and by the way, Xi Jinping says it quite openly. The West is in decline, and the East, as he would call it, the East is on the rise. Now, is that true? And we can debate that and have a discussion about that. There are clearly, the symptoms of decline which are everywhere. Whether it was Trumpism within the United States, whether it's a kind of complete idiots trying to run this country, these are all symptoms of decline. It seems to me at a kind of superficial level, and there are manifestations of decline everywhere. I mean, I completely accept that broad argument. Although decline can go on from tens of years and hundreds of years even. I mean, as my old history teacher used to tell me, the Ottoman Empire was in decline, but it took 400 years for it to finally go over, and it's always stuck in my mind. So decline can happen for a very, very long time before the thing finally comes to an end. So we've got to make a distinction between the general notion of decline and the end of something. I think we've got to be very careful on that one. But you're quite right, they picked this one up, and I've always thought, if I put it bluntly, Savas, China, has benefited from the rise of capitalism in the post-Soviet period. I mean, it latched on to globalization. It latched onto the market. It latched onto openness. Xi Jinping made an extraordinary speech where? The World Economic Forum, January 2017. Do you remember it? When Trump was denouncing globalization in his peculiarly Trump way, Xi Jinping came and said, don't blame all the ills of the world on globalization. It's done a lot of very good things. And, so I think China finds itself, therefore, in a very deep contradiction here, because the very success of the economic order, which we, I think, recognize in different ways, nonetheless was based on the fact that the West was not in decline, that the economic order, largely shaped in and around the United States, was actually flourishing, at least for a period of time, particularly in the 1990s and up until 2008. And so I think they've got themselves into a very, very difficult position here on this one, because they keep talking about the decline of the West, the decline of the Western economic order, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then in some ways, they may be also talking about their own decline as well, because if the West goes down, as they would see it, and enters into a period, of all sorts of problems and difficulties, for whatever set of reasons, maybe even increased conflict with the United States, this is certainly not going to help China, not in the least, not in the least. Exactly. So I think they are, well, I'm not an advisor to Xi Jinping, of course, but if I was to give him any advice, I'd say try and play down decline, maybe. But it's very difficult to try and talk the other thing now, because in a sense, part of the whole ideological structure now is that we're on the rise and they're in decline. So how do you abandon that now without abandoning the central ideological prop of what has become the mainstream view in China? Thanks, Salas. Anyway, good to see you.
Hello. Maybe it's a little bit on a side question, but one thing I was always very interested, more than interested, very passionate by the explanations of Hillel on the Soviet Union, have to do with the role that Hillel in this analysis puts on the role of labor and production, which usually Marxists don't care so much. What is labor? What kind of labor? How labor is organized and how labor is controlled? And I think this is one of the most important things for the theory of Hillel. I don't know if you agree with Hillel.
Never disagree.
But Concerning China, I don't see much this discussion among Marxists.
No, they don't know.
And usually when the debate of the regime and the state in China, always questioning the role of imperialism, the production of value, the role of the state, the role of the Communist Party, but never a question which for us Marxists should be absolutely central, which is there any workers' democracy in China? You have, of course, referred to the question of how the state and the Communist Party control, which is an indirect answer to this. But I've been following the debates on China, and it surprised me a lot that this elementary question, what is the role of workers in production? Are they listened? Do they vote? What's the meaning of their labor? This is almost never enters in the debate. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, I can only partly answer those questions because I just don't know enough. All I can do is tell you what I know. People who do know more than I do have said it on that last question. There is a very large working class in China. I mean, huge, absolutely huge. And indeed, many of the state-owned enterprises, which are largely based, not only based in Manchuria, which is, in a sense, is the industrial heart, used to be the big industrial smokestack heart of traditional Soviet-style industries north of Beijing, which is one of the reasons Beijing had such appalling air for so long, because those factories. Now, many of those went out of business, but many haven't. I think it's very important to know why they haven't gone. Because on market principle, many of those state-owned enterprises should go out of business. You know, as happened to say in East Germany, or happened to many of the countries in Eastern Europe. If you put something on a market basis, an industry which existed for other reasons, i.e. production for production's sake and maintaining full employment, if you put it on a market basis and open it up to the world economy, guess what happens? They go. You know, that's the logic of the market. You know, it's not designed for full employment. It's designed for profitability and designed for can you compete against somebody else. So many of those state-owned enterprises, which I talked about, would actually go under world market conditions. The question is why they've been kept alive. And here again, I think it does get back to your question of the workers. Yeah. I mean, I just think that the party is deeply sensitive to workers. Yeah. I think deeply, I mean, this is my impression. I mean, again, this is only personal and reading through this stuff, but the language is sensitive. Okay, it's workers and peasants, I know, and Hillel talked about the peasantry, but they are very sensitive to the strength of the workers. And they will repress if they organize, but they will make concessions. They feel it's necessary to make concessions in order to prevent workers combining together in any form, not political form, even a trade union form, anything that they can do to keep the working class atomized and to maintain control. But that will mean often concessions. And one of the concessions they've made, in a way, I've said this to economists, and they kind of don't get me, or they don't believe me, or they think I don't know what I'm talking about, all of which may be true, but I don't think so, is in a sense you keep open these very large-scale industries to maintain a kind of level of employment. And you maintain a level of employment because you don't want to deal with the social instability that would follow from the closure of massive numbers of industries, which would lead to even more millions of unemployment, greater levels of unemployment in industrial parts of China. Even the Belt and Road Initiative, I've been talking to people about that, the BRI. People have said on that issue that the BRI, in a sense, is a vehicle for the state-owned enterprises. And they want to kind of sell cheaply surplus steel, which is being produced in these factories. It's perfectly good steel, I'm sure. But yeah, it's good steel. It's a question not of quality. But why do they want to keep these factories open and running and therefore dumping all their steel on world markets, which of course has had an enormous impact on global steel industry? It's because they want to keep these industries running. Why do they want to keep these industries running? Because of workers, yeah. So it's not directly, you know, and again, of course, they started organizing independently, and we know there's been a lot of workers' strikes in China. There's reports on it. I mean, I talked to a friend the other day about it. A number of reports coming through in the Chinese press on Weibo and things like that about workers' strikes and things like that. Sometimes you just round up the leaders, put them in prison for a little while, and then, do something else. Or you may do the opposite thing, which is, make economic and material concessions in order to buy them off. So yeah, I think there's a deep sensitivity. And coming back to Savas's point, this is a revolutionary party, and although it did come to power on the basis through the working class, nonetheless still a revolutionary, has a kind of a relationship of knowing that the workers can be the gravedigger of all systems, including possibly their own. So I think there is a sensitivity to not being stable and viable forever. And look what happened to the Soviet Union. There again, in the back of their mind, there is that fear that what looks stable today was a wonderful quote from Hegel through Marx. You remember that one, of course. Yeah. So thanks for that.
Can I?
It's a long list.
We've got longer. Oh my gosh.
Wait, I've got 3 people online.
Can I?
Bring a number of quick points in, and I can try and deal with them. How's that? Yeah. Okay.
Can I say something?
Oh, hello. Okay. Sorry.
Hello, go ahead.
Okay.
Hello.
Okay. I think Savas was absolutely correct. It's true he quoted me, but still, I think I'm correct and he's correct. There's a problem with this discussion in that it is not interrelating what we all actually stand for, and that is socialism. So you're not interrelating the possibility of the movements which are occurring, of changing the possibilities of entering socialism. In other words, the discussion really is a discussion of, in part, many of the discussions are in relation to the physical increase of the output of particular countries, or the growth of industry in those countries. Now, there's no question that China has developed very considerably over time. There's absolutely no question, because it has. And again, although there are liabilities that it has now, etc., it obviously will continue to grow. And it's equally obvious that Britain is in trouble in a way it hasn't been for many years. And the chances of its growth are clearly low. That's clear, but that is not what many of us are interested in. What we're interested in is the drive towards socialism and the possibility of the movement towards socialism developing faster than it has in the recent past. In the recent past, the last 30 years, there's, if anything, it's been negative in terms of the movement towards socialism. Of course, there are elements which are not in that case. That is what, of course, I was referring to, and which Savas has picked up. And that ought to be our number one interest. So the fact that one particular country has this, that, or the other, it has to be put in relation to this. It's not that we should not discuss their internal conflicts and how far they have progressed. Now, what is also absolutely clear is that there is no socialist country, and there's no country which is moving towards socialism through the actions of its government. So, but most of the discussion is really about the technical development of particular countries. Now, of course, that does have an effect as to their stability and possibility of being overthrown or not overthrown, or them preventing the further progress towards socialism. That's true. But the discussion isn't actually concerned with what I've just said, and which was raised by Savas. And that is what we should be looking at. And what is clear is that in the last 30 years, what we appear to have seen is a backward movement in relation to movement towards socialism.
I think that was implicit.
That is the problem. That is the problem. And of course, the fact that the Soviet Union was lost to Stalinism is the fundamental reason why we're in this position. So the interest, I think, prime interest
has to be to see where progress against capitalism, if not directly to socialism, is underway. And to a degree, you have been discussing that. And it is clear that the United States is no longer as powerful as it was. That's absolutely clear. That doesn't make it a second-rate country. It's still the dominant country in the world and is crucial to the development of capitalism and, of course, to preserving capitalism from socialism. But at the same time, what we see for the first time since 1930-40, for the first time in the United States, we see actually the development of socialist thinking and certain numbers of people moving towards socialism. Now, that is a tremendous change that it has occurred. And of course, it's not an accident that you're getting the opposite, the movement towards what one calls fascism, etc., with Trump. And of course, it's not just Trump, it is the party that he's involved with, that has moved to the far right, effectively. That's the real movement that's occurring at the moment. What we want is a movement towards socialism. And of course, in certain respects, it is occurring, but it's not really being discussed at the moment, it appears. But what we ought also to be discussing is, given the movement to the right, which is occurring in America, as well as a movement to the left, we ought to be able to discuss how will that interrelate with the movements that have been referred to, that i.e. in China. What's going to happen with that? What does it actually stand for in China? Is there any kind of socialist movement? I don't know where or how this could have been written, but I read a few days ago about how there was some sort of movement in Shanghai, which was going towards Trotskyism. That sounded to me fantastic, but I saw it. It is, of course, possible. And it is unlikely that another aspect, it is unlikely, in spite of the terrorist regime they maintain in China, it is likely that there will be movements towards genuine change, as opposed to providing the stability required for officially 700 billionaires in China. That's the kind of thing that we ought to be looking for and seeing what is possible. If we don't see any movement, even the smallest movement, or a possibility of going to socialism, then we have to write off the next few years at least. But I think we do see it in the fact that the alternative has clearly worn itself out. If we look at the majority situation in the world, which is the third world, that's Africa, South America, part of Asia, etc., it's clearly getting worse, not better, and the situation is getting worse. And the solution is not going to be some a wonderful capitalist solution. Quite obviously not. I think we have to consider that what's happening in the United States will be happening elsewhere as well. The failure in Britain of the left is partly a real failure of the left to be able to stand up, say the Labour Party is hopeless. We really have to get down to it, as it were, instead of wasting our time on various completely useless entities. But what we've been doing is talking about the growth of particular sectors. Yes, it's quite true, and they will have an influence, and it's worthwhile knowing it. But the real issue, of course, is what I've just said, and in that respect, Sabas is right.
Well, no, bring other people in. There's nothing to be afraid of.
Comrade, you're next. You're next. You've got to come here.
Oh, wait.
Sorry,
Otherwise,
a long march.
Okay, no worries.
Sorry.
That's a long, right.
Not so long, hang
No
on.
worries.
Yeah.
All right, as we're wrapping up, I will keep this short and brief.
Yeah.
I've heard that several reports in that Central Asia is being taken over by China and not
Yeah.
necessarily Russia. And at that point, a growing conflict between Russia and China is definitely growing. I was wondering how would this change?
Yeah.
How would that change the face of the US versus China conflict?
Yeah.
When Central Asia is already losing its dependence on
Yeah,
Russia?
okay. Well, it's a quick empirical point, really. I have a friend who's just come back from Kazakhstan and merely observational. But he said Chinese economic influence is everywhere. This again gets back to the point which may not take us towards socialism, but at least it's empirically true, which is in essence that the sheer economic strength of China and the surpluses that it's generated, which we talked about earlier on, huge surpluses, gives it therefore enormous ability to, to project its power economically, and indeed, and that economic power to be demanded, and that economic influence to be demanded by elites, particularly authoritarian elites, as exist in Kazakhstan. And one of the areas, and that's certainly true probably, and I know other people who live in Kyrgyzstan who would argue that again Chinese economic influence is going to grow and grow and grow and grow, particularly in the Central Asian republics, which also at the same time, although they were originally part of the old Soviet Union and have elites who speak Russian largely, nonetheless they have been very upset, very worried, and indeed deeply concerned about what Russia's been doing in Ukraine. I mean, whether one agrees with it or not, they've been deeply worried about what Russia's been doing in Ukraine, because they're worrying that they might want to try and do it in one of the Central Asian republics. If there was, so this again has created a great degree of dependency. And China, of course, has clearly exploited that and utilized that material basis. On the other hand, this is I tend, and there was once an argument which in essence said, well, look, when China and Russia will therefore come into conflict over the Central Asian republics, and this was often argued, at least by people in the past, Russia is in decline, right? China's on the rise economically, therefore a declining Russia will feel deeply insecure faced with China in the Central Asian republics. I mean, that was a pretty standard argument, which argued that therefore China and Russia would disagree on fundamentals rather than agree on fundamentals. That doesn't seem to have happened, and the reason I don't think it's happened is I think they've worked out a kind of division of labor. They both want stability, they both want order, they both want to maintain the authoritarian structures, political structures of the Central Asian republics, and one of the ways to do that is in a sense by economic development. And Russia can't compete economically, but it can create conditions of political control. Indeed, it intervened into Kazakhstan earlier last year. So yeah, so no. China's role is therefore growing all the time. No question about it. No question about it. But nobody's resisting it because China delivers on certain things like aid and various other things.
I would just specifically like to ask a question: what Russia's response would be?
Well, I'm just saying. I think in quite a lot of part of the literature, they said that Russia's response would be negative. They wouldn't want to see China's influence grow in what had previously been essentially part of the old Soviet Union. That was the original argument. What I see is that in essence, I think they may, underneath it, they may be deeply worried about rising Chinese economic influence in the region, but both of them have an agreement on one thing. They want stability and order under authoritarian regimes and systems. And as long as you don't have what they call color revolutions, whether those color revolutions have occurred in Ukraine or in Kazakhstan or in Georgia, as long as you can maintain an elite control from the top within an authoritarian structure, I think their mutual interests are therefore, met by doing that. And if China can put money in there and invest there, or open up markets for it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then I think there's a kind of a division of labor between the two, which unites around, the issue of stability and order, and to maintain control from above. And the elites there, it strikes me again, I've not visited the area, but those elites there will in essence accept that as part of the quid pro quo. They've got to live between these two powers and work out the modus vivendi between the two of them. So yeah, that's where I see it anyway.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you for answering my question.
Yeah, I hope it makes sense.
We are now right on time, so can I suggest we end up this session?
Yeah, okay. I was going to reply to Hillel. I mean, what I set myself to do, Hillel, I mean, was to set out basically trying to think through how people should analyze China. And I come at this as a kind of non-China specialist, but somebody who's visited there several occasions and therefore wanted to try and make sense of what I learned and what I'm trying to learn and learn from other people. In terms of the more general question, what we ought to have been discussing, well, I would have discussed that if that's what I set out to discuss, but I set out to discuss something else, which was, there's not, as you said back in '73, there's not much Marxist attempt to analyze the Soviet Union. And what I was trying to do in a very kind of limited, incoherent way, no doubt, was to try and say, what can we try and do to try to understand China, given there's so little analysis on the left and trying to work out what that means. That's all I was trying to do. Are we closer or further away from socialism today than we were back in 1990? I think it's both. I think in some ways the left has suffered, the argument for socialism has suffered massively over the last 30 years. I mean, you can't move away from that. It's been a disaster. I mean, first of all, we've got globalization. Everybody then buys into the market. Everybody then thinks the market is the answer to everybody's solution. All those third world revolutionaries who were once revolutionaries have bought into globalization, you know? and then et cetera, et cetera. Look at the disaster that's been South Africa. I mean, the ANC with all of its hopes and aspirations, look where South Africa, but you know that better than anybody else does. So in some ways, the left is in a weaker position today than it's been. There's no doubt about it. I mean, look at the size of the left-wing groups. They're smaller. Look at the age of the people on the left getting older. Let's be blunt about it. And many of the arguments that are being put forward today by progressives on the left are arguments largely about identity rather than about other things and class. So not that I kind of want to get away from that completely, but so the debates that are occurring even on the progressive left are problematic for me, though I don't want to get into a kind of reactionary view and reaction. So I think we are in very difficult, very, very profoundly, when Marx came out of the 1848 revolution, he said we've got to be a red mole, we've got to be a mole. We said we go underground and all we can do for the period of time until the tide of history turns in a different direction. But I don't think we're there yet. I agree with you what's happening in the United States. There is a left in the United States. It didn't exist before. There's a lot of discontent. There's a hell of a lot of discontent in the world. There's absolutely no doubt about it. You don't have to be an empiricist to look around the world and see how much discontent there is in the world. It's huge. It's huge. And not just in the advanced capitalist countries, but in many of those countries which we once used to call the third world. The discontent is just huge. Why some sections of the left doing reasonably well in South America? Left-wing, so-called left-wing governments, they're doing better than they did before. So yeah, there's no easy answer. There's no straightforward answer to your question. I think we've been in a terrific trough going down. It may well be that trough, that moment is changing, and we are now moving into a very, very different moment. I think we probably are, but without an organized left, which is open, plural, ready for open debate and discussion with people they regard as comrades rather than enemies, then the left will never regroup. And as long as the left, and I get back to a point Mike made this morning, as long as the left is still influenced by Stalinism in one form or another, it's not going to reconstitute itself as a genuine left, which is going to appeal to millions of people as opposed to themselves.
Yeah.